I stood in the doorway of my little cottage, holding the key like it was a living thing. For 52 years it had turned the same lock, opened the same door to the same creak, and now it would belong to strangers. The walls smelled faintly of lavender and lemon oil, just as they always had. I'd scrubbed them that morning, not because they were dirty, but because I couldn't bear the thought of leaving dust behind. Andrew was outside already, pacing beside the car. "Mom, come on," he called, his tone more hurried than unkind. "We don't want to get stuck in traffic." I glanced around the room one last time. The worn floral sofa, the crocheted blanket over the armrest, the corner where George's chair still sat. He'd passed 12 years ago, but I'd never moved that chair. Every time I'd thought about it, something in me said, not yet. Sarah appeared at the door, her smile polite and thin. "The movers took the last box, right? Everything else is handled. You'll be more comfortable with us. No more maintenance or icy driveways." Her words floated through the room like air freshener, light, pleasant, but a little artificial. I nodded and pressed the key into her hand. "It's just a house," I said aloud, though my throat tightened when I said it. She smiled wider, as if I'd said something clever. The car ride was quiet. The road curved along the edge of the sea, the same one George and I used to drive every Sunday. I could smell the salt through the open window, the wind tugging at the edges of my scarf. In the side mirror, the white fence around the garden grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. "Don't look so sad, Mom," Andrew said, glancing at me. "This is a good change. You'll have company, meals on time, no worries. You deserve to rest." I smiled the way mothers do when they don't want to worry their children. I suppose I do. But rest, I thought, was not what I wanted. What I wanted was belonging, a place where my presence didn't feel like a favor. When we pulled into their driveway, the house stood large and clean, its white siding gleaming like a smile that showed too many teeth. The lawn was perfect, trimmed to an inch. A small wooden sign near the porch read, "The Jordans, family, faith, forever." I stepped out slowly, clutching my handbag. Sarah guided me in like a polite hostess, showing off a hotel suite. "Your room's at the back," she said. "It's quiet there, and the bathroom's just across the hall. I already put some of your clothes in the dresser." The room was neat, maybe too neat. A single bed, floral curtains, and the faint smell of new paint. My old clock sat on the nightstand, but my books were missing. "Oh, your boxes," Sarah said, quickly, when she saw me looking. "We stored most of them in the garage for now. Less clutter, right?" I nodded. "Of course." At dinner we sat around the table, Andrew talking about work, Sarah asking about the weather, though the forecast was already on her phone. I tried to join in, but every time I spoke, conversation drifted elsewhere. When I said, "I'll make breakfast tomorrow," Sarah smiled kindly. "Oh no, you just relax, May. You've done enough," that phrase. "You've done enough," landed softly but heavily, like a door closing in slow motion. Later, lying in the unfamiliar bed, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the muffled sounds of their laughter downstairs. The air smelled faintly of someone else's detergent. I whispered into the dark, "It's only temporary, just until I'm strong again." but the silence that followed felt like it didn't believe me. Outside the window, the porch light flickered once, twice, before going out completely. The first week passed in a blur of polite gestures. Sarah brought me tea every morning. Too sweet, too milky, but I drank it anyway. Andrew left early for work and came home tired, always talking about projects and deadlines I couldn't quite follow. I tried to stay out of their way, folding laundry that didn't need folding, watering plants already green. Every time I offered to help, Sarah waved me off with the same sugary tone. "Oh, May, don't trouble yourself. You're here to recover, remember." Recover from what, I wondered. My surgery was months ago. My hip no longer ached. It was something else that hurt now, something I couldn't name. My room was neat, quiet, and sterile. The curtains were a pale pink Sarah had chosen. Cheerful but neutral, she'd said. The dresser smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she'd tucked into the drawers. My books, she promised, would be brought in soon, but days turned to weeks and the shelves stayed empty. One morning I went to make tea in my old teapot, only to find it missing. Sarah appeared smiling. "Oh, that old thing?" I packed it away. The handle was cracked. "You could have burned yourself. We have an electric kettle now." She said it like she was doing me a kindness. That afternoon she rearranged my nightstand. My pills, my glasses, the framed photo of George, all moved slightly, aligned like items in a display window. When I reached to move them back, she appeared in the doorway. "Let's keep things tidy, shall we? Easier for you to find what you need." Her tone was gentle, but her eyes held something else. Control disguised as concern. I told myself I was imagining it. I'd always prided myself on being grateful, easy to live with. But it's strange how quickly a person can start to feel like a guest in her own life. Dinner conversations were the worst. I'd start to tell a story, maybe about George fixing the porch light during a storm, and halfway through Sarah would interrupt with, "Oh, that reminds me, Andrew, did you call the insurance guy?" By the time she finished, my story had evaporated. I'd smile, take another bite, and let the silence do the talking. On the third week, Sarah suggested I give her my bank mail. "It'll be easier for you," she said. "I can handle it while you focus on healing." When I hesitated, she laughed softly. "Don't worry, May. We're family, the word used to mean warmth. Now it sounded like ownership. One evening I caught her in my room while I was supposed to be napping. She was dusting the dresser or pretending to. My top drawer was open. "Oh," she said, startled. "I was just tidying up." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. That night, I took a notebook from my purse and began writing small things, things that felt off, but not wrong enough to say aloud. March 12th. Teapot missing. Pills rearranged. Drawer opened. March 15th. Bank envelope. Not delivered. March 17th. Heard her say, "She likes being managed." The words looked harmless on the page, but they made me feel less invisible. I tried to read before bed, but without my books I ended up holding the one photo I had, me and George, our hands dirty from planting tomatoes. I could almost smell the soil again, that damp, honest scent of work. Here everything smelled of lemon cleaner. That night I heard laughter from downstairs. Sarah's voice sharp and light, Andrew's deeper but muted. Then my name. I couldn't make out the words, but Sarah's tone had that soft, amused pity people use when talking about someone who's no longer in the room. I turned off the light. In the dark, I whispered, I have a room of my own, but it doesn't feel like mine. And somewhere deep down, a small, stubborn part of me, the part that had survived George's death, the part that had built a life from nothing and whispered back, watch carefully, May, something's not right here. Time, I've learned, doesn't pass the same way in someone else's house. It drifts, slow, uneven, like the ticking of a clock that's lost its rhythm. Days turned into weeks before I realized how much had changed. At first it was small things. My mail stopped coming. The envelopes from the bank, the pension statements, the letters from my friend Irene. When I asked Sarah, she smiled like a teacher explaining something to a slow student. Oh, don't worry about those, May. I'm handling it for you. It's all being forwarded here. Saves you the confusion. Confusion. The word stung. I'm not confused, I said quietly. I'd just like to see what's being sent. Of course, she said, her smile freezing in place. But you don't need to stress about it. Andrew and I are keeping everything organized. Later that night, I overheard them in the kitchen, Sarah's whisper and Andrew's tired sigh. She gets anxious about little things. It's normal at her age, as if 78 were a diagnosis, not a number. I didn't say anything the next morning. I just wrote it down in my notebook. April 2nd, mail being handled. April 3rd, Sarah called me anxious. When guests came over, Andrew's colleagues or neighbours, Sarah would gently suggest I rest upstairs. Oh, she gets tired in the evenings, she'd say with a laugh, as if I were a child past bedtime. I'd sit quietly on the edge of my bed, listening to muffled voices below, the clinking of glasses and easy laughter. Once I caught my reflection in the mirror, hair brushed, cardigan buttoned, and realized I looked exactly like what they said I was, a tired old woman waiting to be dismissed. I hated that reflection for believing them. My old books vanished next. At first I thought I'd misplaced them. Then I found one. Pride and Prejudice, the copy George had given me for our first anniversary, sitting in a donation box in the hallway. Sarah, I said, holding it up, these are mine. She blinked. Oh, I thought you'd said you didn't read much anymore. We're clearing clutter, May, simplifying. You'll thank me later. She took the book gently from my hands and placed it back in the box. Later that night, I retrieved it, slid it under my pillow. It smelled faintly of dust and garden soil, the way George's hands always did after working outside. April 6th, books, donated, rescued one, keep hidden. Even Andrew, once so gentle, had changed in quiet ways. He spoke to me like a caretaker, not a son. Mum, Sarah's doing a lot for you, he'd say when I asked to see my account balances. You can trust us, okay? You raised me. You know I'd never do anything wrong. It was meant to reassure me, but it sounded rehearsed, like something he'd practiced. I smiled, nodded, and said the only thing that still felt safe. Of course, dear. Then I went back to my notebook. April 8th, Andrew said, You can trust us. By the third week, I began locking my bedroom door when I went out. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. When I returned from a short walk one afternoon, the lock had been turned from the inside. Sarah was standing in my room, holding a folded towel. "Oh, I was just making your bed. You really don't have to lock this door, May. We're family, remember?" Her voice was warm, but her eyes were sharp, watching my reaction the way a cat watches a bird. I wanted to shout, "Family doesn't need keys," but instead I smiled and said, "Old habits." That night I wrote again, greater than April 10th. Door opened. Family doesn't ask permission. Some nights I'd reread those pages in the soft light of my lamp. The notebook had become my secret companion, proof that my memories were real, that the world hadn't quietly rewritten itself while I wasn't looking. Gaslight doesn't always come as cruelty. Sometimes it comes wrapped in smiles, in phrases like, "We're just helping you," and "You're imagining things." I began to wonder if they even noticed what they were doing, if, in their minds, they truly believed they were caring for me. But care that erases you is not care. And as I turned out the light, I thought, one day I will stop being quiet about this. It was a Wednesday night, the kind that feels half asleep. The house was still except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. I couldn't sleep. My legs ached from sitting too long, my thoughts heavier than my body. I reached for my book under the pillow, Pride and Prejudice, and ran my hand along the worn cover. It had become my ritual. Read a few pages, remember who I was before I became someone to be managed. At around midnight I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, outside my door. I froze. Sarah's voice, low, steady, the kind people use when they're telling secrets. "Tomorrow we'll talk to Mr. Carlyle after breakfast. The facility has an opening." Andrew's voice followed, groggy and uncertain. "I don't know if we're ready for that." "She seems fine. She seems fine," Sarah said sharply. "You didn't see her today. She couldn't find her pills. She's slipping, Andrew. And what if she falls again? You said yourself we can't risk her being alone if something happens." There was a pause. I could almost hear him rubbing his forehead, like he always did when he wanted to avoid a fight. Then her tone softened, coaxing. "Once it's official, it'll be easier for everyone. We'll transfer the rest of the funds. I've already spoken to the lawyer. We'll say it's for her care. She won't even have to sign anything. We've got the power of attorney." My breath caught. Power of attorney? I hadn't signed anything like that. At least, not that I remembered. Andrew murmured, "I just don't want her to think we're locking her away," Sarah finished. Her whisper turned almost playful. "It's not locking her away, it's protecting her. And once the accounts are settled, we can focus on getting this place fixed up. The loan will be covered." My chest went cold. I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from gasping. They moved down the hall, their voices fading, a door closing softly behind them. I sat there in the dark, trembling, not from fear, but from the slow, sick realization that everything I'd been doubting was true. They weren't helping me, they were handling me. The papers I'd signed after my surgery, insurance forms, Sarah had said, flashed in my mind. I remembered how she'd guided my hand, saying, "Just sign here, May. It's standard procedure." How could I have been so trusting? I slipped out of bed, heart thudding. The house was silent again. I moved slowly, barefoot, careful not to make the floorboards creak. Andrew's office door was ajar. The faint blue glow of his computer still lit the desk. Inside, neat stacks of papers lay on the surface. Folders, invoices, printed emails. My name was on one of them. I picked it up, my fingers shaking. Application, Maplewood Assisted Living. Reason for admission, early cognitive decline, requires supervision with finances. My stomach turned. I flipped through the rest of the folder and saw the signatures, my own, copied or forged. Power of attorney, May Jordan to Andrew Jordan. The ink looked darker than the rest of the text, uneven, as if printed over a scanned image. Behind it was a printed bank statement showing withdrawals, several large ones, labeled transfer to family account, $20,000, $35,000, $75,000, and more. My hands went numb. I whispered, "They took everything." For a moment, the room spun. I gripped the desk until my breathing steadied. Then I noticed another document, half tucked under the keyboard. A note from a lawyer named Carlyle and Howe, pending sale of secondary property. Client, May Jordan, to be finalized upon signature confirmation, secondary property. My cottage, sold. I sank into the desk chair, my knees weak. The lavender garden, George's chair, the chipped kitchen tiles, all of it gone, carved into numbers on a page. Outside, a car passed by, its headlights sliding across the wall. In that pale light, I saw myself reflected in the dark computer screen, small, wrinkled, but very much alive. And in that reflection, I didn't see a frail old woman. I saw the same woman who'd buried her husband, raised a child alone, kept a roof over their heads, and learned how to balance a checkbook without ever missing a cent. They'd mistaken my kindness for confusion, my trust for weakness. I stood up, folded the papers carefully, and slipped them into my robe pocket. As I turned to leave, I whispered into the quiet room, "You will not bury me alive." Back in my room, I closed the door softly and sat on the bed until dawn painted the edges of the curtains gold. By morning, I knew exactly what I had to do. The morning light came pale and thin through the curtains. I hadn't slept, but my body felt strangely alert, like every cell had remembered its purpose overnight. Downstairs, I could hear Sarah humming in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, the bright sound of a normal day. It all felt unreal, that she could pour orange juice with the same hands that had just signed away my life. I moved quietly, still in my robe, heart hammering in my throat. The folder in my pocket felt heavy, not just with paper, but with truth. When I reached the mirror, I saw how pale I looked. But there was something else there too. Steadiness. I thought of George, the way he used to say, "You can't fight a storm by shouting at it. You stand firm and wait for the wind to tire." That's what I would do. Stand firm. After breakfast, Sarah suggested I rest again. "You've been restless lately, May. Maybe a nap will help." She smiled and I smiled back. The kind of polite exchange that hides whole wars behind it. Maybe you're right, I said. I'll lie down for a bit. Instead, I waited upstairs until I heard her car leave. Andrew was gone too. I'd seen him pull out earlier. Then I went to work. Andrew's study smelled faintly of paper and stale coffee. The blinds were drawn, leaving the room dim. I started with the desk drawers, one by one, methodically. Receipts, insurance forms, a few bills, then a locked drawer. I tugged gently. It rattled, but didn't open. I searched the room for a key, under the mouse pad, behind a photo frame, and finally tucked in a small ceramic dish on the shelf. When the lock clicked open, I exhaled shakily. Inside were two neat stacks of documents. The top one was labeled MJ Financials. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. Bank transfers totaling $180,000, all from my savings account, a forged authorization form for a joint account in Andrew's name, a note from the lawyer, power of attorney approved, and then the deed to my cottage, signed, notarized, stamped, sold. The buyer's name was unfamiliar. Below it, a notation, proceeds applied toward existing family debt, a Jordan. Family debt. That's what my life had been turned into. Collateral. My breath came unevenly. For a long moment I just sat there, clutching the papers to my chest. I'd spent my life teaching Andrew to be honest. When he was 12 and stole a candy bar, I'd marched him back to the shop and made him apologize. I'd thought that lesson stuck. But maybe this wasn't about honesty. Maybe it was about something worse. Entitlement. Somewhere along the way, my son had started to believe my love meant ownership. I gathered everything, the bank statements, the signed forms, the assisted living application, each one a piece of a puzzle that spelled out betrayal. I placed them in a small envelope and tucked it into the lining of my suitcase beneath my nightgown and a photo of George. The house was silent. Sunlight crept across the carpet like a slow clock. Then I heard the crunch of tires on gravel, Sarah's car returning. I zipped the suitcase halfway shut and sat on the bed, pretending to read a magazine. My heart pounded so loud I was sure she'd hear it through the walls. A knock on the door. May? You awake? I swallowed. Just resting, dear. Good, she said cheerfully. We'll have dinner early tonight. Andrew's got some paperwork to finish, so we'll be eating in the den. Don't worry about setting the table. Her footsteps retreated. Paperwork. Of course. I waited until her voice drifted downstairs again before finishing my packing. I only took what mattered. A change of clothes, my notebook, my ID, the envelope of evidence, and George's old pocket watch. Everything else could stay. By dusk, the plan had taken shape in my mind. I'd leave that night, quietly, without confrontation. I didn't want shouting or apologies or the weight of their guilt pressing against me. I wanted freedom, not permission. As the sun disappeared, I sat by the window and watched the first streetlight flicker on. Its glow fell across the gravel path like a guide. I thought of my cottage by the sea, the one they'd sold without asking, the small gate that had squeaked when George came home, the lavender that brushed against his boots. They'd taken that from me, but not the memory. And memories, I realized, can be a kind of map. I stood, tightened the belt of my coat, and whispered to the empty room, "You made me invisible in this house. Now watch me disappear for real." Then I turned off the light. Downstairs I could hear the soft murmur of television voices, Sarah laughing at something, Andrew answering with half interest. The clink of dishes told me dinner had ended. Soon the house would settle into its usual rhythm, Sarah scrolling through her phone, Andrew in the study pretending to work. I waited. I'd done enough waiting in my life. For trains, for phone calls, for kindness. But this kind of waiting was different. This was the stillness before a storm breaks. At 9:12 p.m. I slipped my shoes on, comfortable, worn soles, quiet on the wooden floor. I wrapped a scarf around my shoulders and zipped my coat. My suitcase, packed and ready, waited by the door like a loyal dog. The hallway light glowed faintly, casting long shadows. Every sound, every creak of the floor, every sigh of the house felt amplified. I moved slowly, step by step. In the kitchen I paused. The moonlight spilled through the window, silvering the edges of the counter. On the table sat a vase of lilies Sarah had bought that morning. Their scent filled the room, strong, almost suffocating. Beside them lay my pill organizer, Monday through Sunday, neatly labelled, half empty. I picked it up, turned it over, and placed it gently in the trash. They had managed my pills for months, always insisting they knew best. I didn't even know which were truly mine anymore. For the first time in a long time, I decided to trust my own judgment, not theirs. Outside, the night air was cool and clear. I closed the front door softly behind me and stepped onto the gravel path. The gate was stiff, but it opened with a muted squeak, the same sound that used to mean freedom when I took morning walks before they began helping. At the end of the lane, I turned for one last look. The house was dark, except for the glow from the den window. Shadows moved, Andrew pacing, Sarah on the couch. They looked content, safe, certain of their control. They didn't notice the absence upstairs. A flicker of guilt passed through me, maternal instinct, the stubborn, irrational love that persists even when betrayed. But guilt has no place beside survival. I whispered into the wind, "I raised you to stand on your own, Andrew." I guess now it's my turn. The taxi pulled up right on time, headlights cutting through the quiet. The driver, a young man with tired eyes, helped me with the suitcase. "Airport?" he asked. I hesitated, then shook my head. "No, the bus terminal, please." He nodded and drove off, the engine humming low. As the house disappeared behind the curve of the road, I felt something in me unclench, a knot that had lived just below my ribs for months. I opened the small notebook in my lap, the one where I'd recorded every missing item, every lie disguised as kindness. At the bottom of the last page I wrote, "Left the house, 9:37 p.m., October 6th. Breathing freely again. At the terminal I bought a ticket under my maiden name, May Harlow. It felt right, like reclaiming a part of myself that had been filed away in someone else's drawer. The destination, Ravenport, the small coastal town where George and I had spent our honeymoon 40 years ago. The woman at the counter smiled. "Travelling alone, dear." I returned the smile. Not anymore. On the bus, I watched the lights blur past, street after street, life continuing, as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. The betrayal had burned away my old illusions, leaving only what mattered: clarity, resolve, and the faint unbreakable thread of dignity. As the city lights faded and darkness stretched wide, I leaned against the window and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like freedom. The first morning after leaving, I woke in a motel room that smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. The sheets were rough, the air cold, but the silence was mine, earned, unshared. When I looked in the mirror, I almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her hair was thin, her face pale, but her eyes, my eyes, had something new in them. Not fear, not yet peace, but direction. At the bank, I met with the branch manager, a young woman named Aisha, who seemed startled by my composure. "We'll freeze all accounts immediately, Mrs. Jordan," she said. "You did the right thing coming in." The words felt strange. You did the right thing. I hadn't heard that in a long time. By the afternoon, I was sitting across from a lawyer named Elise Becker. Her office was small but bright, filled with shelves of case files and potted plants. She listened without interrupting as I told her everything: the missing mail, the forged power of attorney, the night I overheard them planning my disappearance. When I finished, she said softly, "What they did is financial abuse, May. It's more common than people think, but you are not powerless. We spent hours on forms, revoking the old documents, assigning my niece Clara as executor, notifying Adult Protective Services. Elise worked with quiet focus, explaining every clause. Her calm steadied me. When she finally asked if I wanted to pursue charges, I hesitated. They stole from me, I said, but I let them because I believed love was safety. Elise looked at me for a long time, then nodded. You're not the first to confuse the two. Later that week, she called with another revelation. May, she said, your cottage was sold twice, once legitimately, and again under a loan Andrew took against it. For a moment I couldn't speak. I imagined the garden, my late husband's rose bushes, the window where I used to read at dusk. Gone, all of it. Elise's voice was gentle. We can fight this. I shook my head. I don't want revenge. I want peace. They found me eventually, not in person, just in words. The first letter came on thick, expensive paper from a law firm in the city. Mrs. May Jordan, you left without notice or cause. Your son and daughter-in-law are distressed and believe mediation would be in everyone's best interest. We request your cooperation to settle financial misunderstandings amicably. Misunderstandings, that's what they called it. The second letter came a week later, in Sarah's handwriting, round, soft, calculated. May, I don't understand why you're doing this. You've broken Andrew's heart. We were only trying to help you. Please come home. We can fix this. I read both letters at the kitchen table of my small rental, hand steady, pulse slow. Then I took a small metal dish from the cupboard, placed the pages inside and struck a match. The flame caught quickly, curling the paper until only ash remained. In my journal I wrote, "Greater than silence is not weakness. It is the sound of the door closing." That night I slept deeply. No dreams, no ghosts. It was Irene who saved me from solitude. She'd heard from Clara what had happened and called out of the blue one afternoon, "May Jordan, if you think you're going to fade quietly into the wallpaper, you're mistaken. Pack a bag, you're coming to the coast." Her voice was sunlight, warm and impossible to ignore. By week's end I was standing on the porch of her seaside cottage, the scent of salt and rosemary in the air. Irene hugged me fiercely and fed me soup that tasted like kindness. Through her I met Laya, a community coordinator who helped older women find safe housing. Within a week I had a small room of my own above a bakery, nothing grand but clean, bright and mine. I started volunteering at the local library. Wednesday mornings became my favorite time. A circle of children sitting cross-legged, eyes wide as I read Charlotte's Web or The Secret Garden. When they clapped, I felt something return, a quiet usefulness, not managed, not minimized, just me doing something that mattered. Some evenings I'd walk by the water, tracing my initials in the wet sand. The tide always took them, but that was all right. I'd whisper, "Still here," and let the sea carry it away. It was Lucas who found me. He appeared at the library one Friday afternoon, taller than I remembered, his hair falling over his eyes. For a moment I thought I was seeing a ghost. Andrew's face at 16, softened by regret. "Grandma," he said quietly, "can I talk to you?" We sat on a bench outside, the ocean wind tugging at his sleeve. His voice trembled when he spoke. "I should have noticed the way they treated you. I'm sorry. I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say." I reached for his hand. "You were a child, Lucas. The silence wasn't yours to carry." He blinked back tears. "Dad said you didn't want to see us anymore." I smiled, gentle but firm. "That's not true. I just didn't want to see them on their terms." We talked for hours about school, his dreams, the things he'd been too afraid to ask. When he left, he hugged me tightly, whispering, "I love you." "I love you too," I said. "Family isn't who keeps you. It's who lets you be." The mornings here are slow and golden. I wake to the smell of bread from the bakery below and the sound of seagulls outside my window. The room is small, one chair, one bed, one kettle, but it feels enormous after what I escaped. I sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the light stretch across the sea. The world feels steady again, unhurried. Sometimes I think about Andrew and Sarah, not with hatred, not even anger anymore, just distance. They have to live with what they did. I only have to live with what I've reclaimed. Freedom isn't a gift, I've realized. It's a decision, one you make again and again. Each morning you choose not to return to what broke you. I'm not waiting for justice. I'm not waiting for apology. Just peace. I close my journal, sip my tea, and whisper to no one in particular. Greater than, "You're never too old to start again." They called it running away. I call it coming home.